The elevator doors open, and an old lady enters. As she shuffles in, she doesn't see me leaning against the back wall. She's wearing a scratchy-looking purple sweater, purple sweatpants, and glasses with lenses as thick as my thumb. She turns to face the doors as they slide closed. I watch, waiting for her to press the button to her floor. As the elevator begins to move, I feel obliged to say something. "Fifth floor?" I ask, nodding to the small white 5 on the panel, lit with golden light. She turns, her eyes wide as if surprised to see me. "What's that?" "Are you going to the 5th floor?" I ask a little louder. No, 4th, she says, turning back around. She still hasn't pressed a button, and now I have a social obligation. I don't know how to do this without making her feel stupid, so I lean forward and press the button for her. She says nothing. I look over at her white hair, which is sticking up at all angles as if she's just been electrocuted. She's got way too much hairspray on. It's pungent, suffocating. A single flame in here and she'd light up like a Christmas tree. She's the type of old that doesn't really notice the world around her. I'm pretty sure she's already forgotten that I'm in the elevator. I could give her a heart attack if I wanted, grab her shoulder, scream, and watch her drop like a fainting goat. That image shouldn't be funny to me, I know that, but I can't help myself. Bad thoughts find me. I don't go looking. The elevator stops and the doors open to the 4th floor. The woman gets off, and I have the small space, still fragrant with her hairspray, to myself. Suddenly, I feel the weight of all the decisions I've made leading to this point. It sits in my throat like bad acid reflux. My therapist tells me that we are the products of all the choices we've made in our lives, and each day is a new choice, a chance to reshape who and what we are. I will myself to step out of the elevator, to be someone different, to not do what I've come there for. Maybe I could join the old lady for a cup of tea, spray my own head with copious amounts of flammable chemicals. We could play bridge, become best friends. I'd call William, tell him it's over. The doors begin to close, and I reach out a hand to press the open button, my finger hovering over the plastic as I wait for myself to push forward, to watch the golden light fill the small white circle. But I don't. I lower my hand. The doors hum shut. I knock on the door of flat 502. After a few seconds of silence, it snaps open. And there he is, William, smile on his face, slight stubble gracing his angular chin, eyebrows straight over pale blue eyes. His hair is unkempt and slightly graying around the ears, and he's wearing a white dress shirt tucked into jeans. On anyone else it would look ridiculous, but because he's attractive, because he's a brilliant professor, somehow it's endearing. "Jeannie," he says. "There's my girl." He doesn't mind that I'm 10 minutes late. He's just happy to see me. And his happiness is like measles. It's airborne, highly contagious. "How's the conference?" I ask, stepping through the doorway. The room has a small living area, TV, kitchenette, and bedroom behind a partially closed door. From the window on the far side of the room, I can see the Thames and St. Paul's Cathedral. I make a mental note to visit the latter. I'm not religious, but I like the small inward feeling I get when standing beneath those stone pillars, the ancient holy art, and the great dome, which seems to rise endlessly toward the heavens. "Oh, you know," William says, "if you've been to one—" He waves a hand. He doesn't want to talk about the conference or business, even though I know he presented an important paper to important people. He doesn't want to talk at all, actually. But I like to chit-chat with him first, watch him squirm, wait for that moment when his patience is just tipping toward annoyance before I take my clothes off.
Margot pulled up to the curb outside her Uncle Luke's house, turned off the engine and slumped back against her seat. Through the passenger side window, she gazed up at the squat 70s ranch style, and her body prickled with dread. The last time she'd spent the night here in Wakarusa, in the town where she grew up, was 20 years ago. She'd been 11. Margot's hometown was originally called Salem, but the name was changed in the 1850s to avoid confusion with the other Indiana Salem. The etymology had gotten lost to history, but conventional wisdom was that the Native American Wakarusa could be translated to knee-deep in mud. Both the old name and the new struck Margot as uncanny in their appropriateness. One evoked the killing of innocent girls. The other insinuated just how hard it was to leave. Though to Margot, the mud seemed more like quicksand. The more you fought it, the more it pulled you under. For years, she thought she'd escaped. And now here she was, back again. But more than just the town, what was making Margot's heart pound now was what version of her uncle she was going to get tonight. The real one? Or the bad one? She took a deep breath, then grabbed her bags from the back seat and made her way up the path. On her uncle's front landing was a bulb in a wire cage illuminating the space with a flickering yellow light. The sound of moths beating their bodies against it reminded Margot of childhood summers here. Long, hot days of skinned knees and calves cut up from fields of corn. She lifted a fist and knocked. After a moment, Margot heard the plunk of a deadbolt. Then the door creaked slowly, barely open. Her pasted-on smile faltered. "Uncle Luke?" Through the dark crack of the doorway, she studied the changes in her uncle since she'd seen him last. The lines on his face seemed to have deepened in the intervening months, and his dark hair was unusually mussed. One thing that hadn't changed, however, was the red bandana around his neck, the one she'd given him for Christmas 25 years ago, which he still wore often. His eyes flicked over her face. "Rebecca?" Margot swallowed. Despite sharing only superficial similarities with her uncle's late wife, short brown hair and an average build, Margot was used to Luke calling her by the other woman's name. Still, it stung every time. "I'm Margot, remember? Your niece? Adam's daughter?" This was the part that twisted in her stomach. Adam's daughter didn't convey that he, Luke, was more of a dad to her than her father had ever been. Niece didn't capture that. Besides his late wife, she was his favorite person and he hers. But it was best to start small, jog his memory, and the rest would usually follow. "Margot." Her uncle said her name as if he were trying out the syllables for the first time. "That's my name, but usually you call me Kid." Margot kept her voice bright and even. Luke blinked once, twice, and then finally, as if someone had gone in and swiped a hand across old cobwebs, his eyes cleared. "Kid!" He swung the door open and extended his arms wide. "My God, you're here! What took you so long?" Margot forced out a laugh as she rushed into his open arms, but her throat felt tight. She'd never get used to the fear that she'd finally lost him for good. "Sorry about that, kid," he said when they let go. "I've been forgetting things in my old age." He said it dismissively, as if forgetting your family was as innocuous as misplacing your keys. But there was a shadow of embarrassment darkening his eyes. She waved a hand. "It's fine." "Well, how the hell have you been? Oh, here, let me help you with those bags."
The T-shirt shop smelled overpoweringly of patchouli oil. Perched on a stool near the cash register, Emma wondered if she'd ever get the musky, sweet scent of it out of her clothes. "Put these in that corner." Raven held out an armful of handmade signs and tilted his head towards the back of the shop. beyond the stacks of T-shirts with peaceful slogans, beaded necklaces, and carved wooden symbols. "Sure thing." Emma jumped to her feet and bounded over. There were about 15 signs, the paint barely dry. They swung as she walked to the back of the small shop, sending random words flashing in vivid red, green, and blue. Emergency, danger, strike. It was after closing time, but Raven had asked her to stay late and help him get ready for the protest march planned for the weekend. A shaggy-haired political zealot, Raven managed this North London shop and spent the rest of his time organising a left-wing protest group. He was 33 years old, but looked younger because of the hair and the tattoos. His birth name was David Lees, but he'd changed it legally 8 years ago to the more memorable Raven Hawkhurst. In action on the streets, he was the protest equivalent of a lightweight boxer, small and relentless, jabbing black and red anarchy flags at riot police, his thin face disguised behind a checkered scarf. In person, he was resentful and paranoid, convinced the government was after him. Which, to be fair, they were. It had taken weeks working undercover for Emma to make her way into his inner circle, and even longer to get close enough to earn his trust. Almost as soon as she'd done it, though, she decided he wasn't ever going to pose any real danger. He wasn't smart enough or organised enough to bring about the revolution of his dreams. He liked the drama and distraction of a punch-up with the cops, but he was no terrorist. She'd told her bosses as much more than once, but they'd overruled her, insisting she stay and dig deeper. The group's online fundraising received a surprising amount of money funneled through a number of sources, but originating in Russia. And so here she was, stacking protest signs in a fug of patchouli. Setting the signs down, she turned back. "Sounds like the march will be massive on Saturday." In character, she gave her voice a flat-edged northern accent. Raven believed she was an activist from Manchester. He barked a bitter laugh. "You know how many people live in this city?" He didn't wait for her to answer. 14 million. You get 10,000 at a protest? That's not success. That's abject failure. Grabbing the remaining signs, he lugged them to the back without waiting for her to help. People want to drive their SUVs to their kids' private schools and think they'll save the environment by not using plastic straws. He was always morose the day before a march. Emma left him to rant and headed back to finish her work with the cans of paint as he warmed to his topic. He'd got as far as, "They'll care when we take their mansions away," when her phone vibrated. She pulled it from her pocket and glanced at the screen. It held only one word. Home. "Raven," she said, raising her voice to break through his familiar liturgy. "I've got to take this call. Be right back." There was an indignant pause, and then she heard him mutter, "Oh, typical." She hurried out onto the pavement, hitting answer as soon as the door closed. "This is Makepeace, 1075. An unfamiliar female voice said, "Hello, Emma. I've got a message from home. Are you safe to take it now?" Emma looked up and down the quiet street. There was no one nearby. "Now is fine. The message follows. Your mother is ill. She needs you urgently. Do you need me to repeat?" Emma's heart began to race, but she kept her voice cool. "Got it, thanks." When she ran back into the shop, Raven was at the front gathering the last of the paint. "I'm really sorry. I have to go home. There's an emergency." Emma raced behind the cash register to grab her bag. Exuding silent condemnation, he fixed her with a beady look. "That was me mum," she explained, giving her voice a worried tone. "She's ill and there's nobody else to look after her. I've got to go." "Oh, fine." He gestured at the shop with an arm that had the words "No Justice" tattooed from wrist to elbow. "And I'll just do this all myself, I guess." Deliberately misunderstanding him, she cast him a grateful smile. "That'd be fab. You're a star. See you."
Michaela remembered when she had found out. It was the day of his arrest. It was 8:30 in the evening, and she was going to visit her mother on Trondheimsgata. It was early June, but the air had the chill of an October day, and the area outside the flats was full of people. When she got closer, upset faces turned toward her, and within the space of a few minutes, she had the highlights. Giuseppe Costa, or Beppe, as they called him, had killed a soccer referee. His son Mario's team, Bromma Poikana Academy under-17s, had been playing, and toward the end of the second half, Beppe had run onto the field, heavily inebriated, and begun stirring things up, lashing out. It had taken 5 or 6 people to wrestle him onto the turf. Afterward, when everyone thought the situation had calmed down, he had reportedly followed the referee with a crazed look in his eyes. "That sounds completely insane," she said, and went up to her mother, who was on the walkway outside her flat, looking down at everyone below. Her mother had her long grey hair down and was wearing slippers without socks and a new loose floral blouse. There was a stiff breeze, and she looked worried, as if she were afraid something had happened to one of her sons. "De che stanno hablando?" she said. "They say Beppe's killed a soccer referee," Michaela replied. Her mother was relieved that Simone hadn't done something idiotic again or potentially fatal. Later, when they were eating dinner, she brought it up again. "Only to be expected," she said. Not that Michaela gave it much thought at the time. It was just the kind of thing people regurgitated, she assumed. But afterward it had bothered her. It suddenly felt as if Beppe had been born to kill a ref. The whole of Husby erupted with rumours and old stories that paved an inevitable path to murder, and perhaps that was why Michaela relayed other things too. One incident in particular that stood out. She'd been only 11 or 12 at the time, and back then she'd heard about Beppe pretty often. Fights, scenes at the bar in Husby, rowdiness and shouting from his flat. In those days, Simon, her eldest brother, was into hip-hop. Sometimes it felt as though hip-hop was the only thing not killing him, and like so many others, he was afraid of Beppe. The boys who played Eminem on their boom boxes, Beppe would kick them around the square. But Beppe must have realized that Simon was in desperate need of validation because he made some sort of approach, and one day he took him aside and they rehearsed. Later that night, Beppe stepped right up to the barbecue area outside the flats and whistled. He was going to do a song, he said. "Not now! We don't feel like it!" people shouted. "Shut your hole! I've got something special for you," he said, beckoning Simon over. Simon waved dismissively and seemed just as awkward and lost as ever. But then he did a couple of dance moves she'd never seen before. And when he and Beppe rapped, "I'm the lost son with a life of crime, I'm the one they're calling in to 999, the song Simon had written, Michaela couldn't think of a time when people had shouted with so much glee outside the flats. It wasn't so strange, really. She guessed that all murderers had done good things, too. Yet it lingered with her, a kind of unsolved mystery. She told the story a couple of times after the murder and eventually heard from Jonas Beyer that Beppe himself wanted to speak to her. "Would you say there's a conflict of interest in your relationship with Costa?" Beyer asked. "I don't know," she said. But Beyer didn't seem to hear her hesitation, instead telling her to establish contact and see if you can get him to talk. It was a long shot, of course. Nothing had worked so far. Costa had barely managed to stay on topic during questioning and hadn't even admitted to what everyone could see on the video footage from the game.
Thank God, Chloe thought, as headlights swept through the corn, alerting her to the arrival of her first guests. She loved this part, the beginning of the party part. Absolutely anything could happen now. She checked her phone screen just in time to watch the numbers switch from 6:59 to 7. Showtime. The genius of her party was this. People had to go through these scary corn mazes and get chased by chainsaw dudes before they were rewarded with booze and music at the center of the field. Chloe was pretty proud of it. She knew everything was set up, but she still double-checked that the camping lanterns were all lit, that the keg was ready, that the band was getting its gear together. She greeted her first guests, did a shot, and then did a bonus shot. What the hell? It was her party. And that's when she overheard someone talking about how the corn maze wasn't even scary because Mark Evans hadn't turned his chainsaw on. He was just making the chainsaw noise by blowing air through his lips. She felt her jaw clench. You've got to be kidding me. The sun had fully set by this point, and the only light came from the camping lanterns circling the edges of the clearing behind her, gaslit flames flickering like fireflies. Chloe beelined for the maze, but hesitated when she reached the entrance. It was darker than she'd expected it to be. A lot darker than it had been when she was talking to Mark 20 minutes ago. The entrance was a gaping black mouth. She imagined it snapping closed around her the moment she stepped inside. She swallowed. "Mark?" she whisper-shouted, taking a single step forward. Fallen corn stalks cracked beneath her feet, and it struck her that the sound was brittle, like bones breaking. She felt a flicker of fear and quickly pushed the thought away. It was the exact same maze she'd been through a million times in the daylight. There was no reason to get all freaked out. She said, louder now, "Mark, get out here." No answer. He was going to make her come find him, wasn't he? Well, fine, if he wanted to do it that way. She turned a corner, and then another, and then... there. A figure in the shadows, holding a chainsaw. Chloe exhaled. "I thought we'd agreed you were going to turn the chainsaw on," she said, searching for Mark's giant arms in the shadows. "If you just make the noises with your mouth, it's seriously..." The moon slid out from behind a cloud, its soft silver light glinting off the chainsaw's chain. Chloe stopped talking. Wait. The chain. It was old and a little rusty looking, and even from a few feet away, Chloe could see the jagged metal teeth, so sharp. That chain definitely wasn't supposed to be there. Chloe blinked twice, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. "What are you?" The chainsaw revved to life, those jagged teeth spinning into a metallic blur. Chloe parted her lips, but she couldn't scream. Her voice had shriveled up somewhere inside her throat. Her mouth flapped open and closed, wordless, her hands flying up instinctively to protect her face. The scream wouldn't have helped her anyway. It was much, much too late for that. The chainsaw flew closer, whirring and grinding. The sound it made an electric howl, until it hit bone.
"Well, will you look at what the cat finally dragged in an hour late?" Molly Sutton drawled from where she sat perched on the edge of Joy's desk. It was an old desk, a little battered but beautifully carved. It fit with the Art Deco decor in the lobby of Broussard's Private Investigations, LLC. Her boss, Burke Broussard, liked nice things, and he loved New Orleans. Their office space on the quarter's edge was a lot more expensive than an equivalent space in the burbs, but Burke swore it was worth it for the foot traffic alone. Their full roster of well-to-do clients seeking highly qualified and discreet private investigators, as their business card said in a very dignified script, seemed to prove him right. Scowling, Joy Thomas piloted her electric wheelchair behind the desk with practiced ease. "You shut up. I am not that late." Molly laughed. "You're always here at 8 and you know it. Besides, is that any way to talk to the person who brought you coffee?" She held out a cup from the coffee house, fixed just the way Joy liked it. "I figured you'd be a little rough this morning, so I came prepared." Joy eyed the offered cup, then took it with a reluctant nod of thanks. Considering you're the reason I feel like death warmed over this morning, you should have brought me coffee. Molly lifted her brows, unable to hide her smile. I'm the reason. I don't remember holding your nose and pouring 3 hurricanes down your throat, Mrs. Thomas. She held up 3 fingers. 3 hurricanes, Joy. 3. She cocked her head. Do you see 3 fingers? Or 6? Joy flipped her the bird. I see just 1. Molly choked on another laugh. In her mid-50s, Joy looked so prim, so matronly and proper. Never a hair out of place, she always dressed like a woman going to afternoon tea, a string of pearls ever present around her throat. The only thing missing was elbow-length gloves, and Molly bet that Joy had a pair of those, too. Joy might have appeared prim and frail at first glance, but the woman was strength personified. One of the first black women to reach detective rank in the NOPD, Joy's career had ended after she was injured in the line of duty. Reinventing herself, she'd gotten her CPA license so that she could support herself and her 4 kids, then teenagers, now amazing adults. She was more than their office manager, their bookkeeper. She was like a mother, too. Having lost her own mother, Molly accepted Joy's mothering with gratitude. Don't know why you're not miserable, Joy groused, but her expression softened with her first sip of the coffee. It's still hot. She narrowed her eyes. You brat. You were late, too. Molly grinned, unconcerned. Burke ran a pretty loose ship, and they all worked plenty of hours when they were on cases. Guilty as charged. Joy took another sip, closing her eyes. This is the good stuff. None of that burned crap from that other coffee shop. Never, Molly said solemnly. And I'm not miserable because I was the designated driver who got all y'all's asses home safely. You're welcome, woman.
The first time I saw Newton Reddick, he was drunk outside the Poquelin Society building on East 47th Street. He was leaning against a cart filled with dollar paperbacks, looking pretty jaunty and not at all minding the cold. The Poquelin was a private library that had been started during the Gilded Age by a gang of bank clerks who believed reading during their lunch hours would make them into Rockefellers and Carnegies. It was still a private library in 2005, and also a scholarly society dedicated to the art, science, and preservation of the book, whatever that meant. Its membership rolls included a lot of academics, rare book dealers, and a few unfashionable, old-money eccentrics who came down from the East 70s on the chance of finding a literary evening. Newton Reddick was one of the book dealers, or had been anyway. I was told he was mainly a collector now. Collector seemed to me an overly polite term, but at least it conveyed the fact he wasn't making any money at it. He was living off his wife, a much younger woman with inherited wealth to whom he'd been married just under 10 years. That earned him a certain pride of place among the library's members, it appeared. He was holding court outside the Poquelin, leaning against that paperback cart and waving a cigarette around in his free hand, while a trio of red-faced old-timers hugged themselves against the cold and seemed to hang on his every word. His voice, a crisp tenor, bounced off the skyscrapers and carried across the street to where I was standing with a coffee from the bodega on the corner of 5th and 47th. He was talking about somebody named Richardson. The problem with Richardson, he was explaining to the others, is the man has no sense of history, no feeling of a higher purpose. He thinks a Pulitzer makes a book worthy. The error of that kind of thinking was obvious to the little assembly outside the Poquelin, and before stubbing out their cigarettes and going back inside, they had a few more choice words for the Richardsons of the world, the ones who can't see the forest for the trees, who wouldn't know greatness if it walked up and punched them square in the nose. They were a lively bunch, those old bookmen. On another night, under different circumstances, I might have enjoyed listening to their fool talk. It was a Tuesday in November, just before Thanksgiving. All over the city, people were drinking more than they should and visiting friends. It was the season for parties and parades and little flings that didn't mean anything. Normally, I kept away from divorce work, but the case had come to me on referral. A woman calling herself Anna Reddick had shown up at my apartment the previous week, on Thursday evening, saying that she had met my friend Ulises Lima at a party. Ulises was a Venezuelan poet who sent me a lot of work. He thought it was awfully funny that I was a lawyer, not an artist or a writer or a poet like everyone else. He thought it was even funnier that I refused to work any longer at one of the big law firms in Midtown and was trying to make a go of it on my own in a careless and not very profitable way. He had sent around a good number of prospective clients for consultations. There were always people in his world who needed help and hadn't any ideas where to begin looking for it. Some had money, and others would try to pay me with paintings or meals. Sometimes I took them up on it, though I didn't have an eye for that kind of thing, the visual arts, and I would have to ask someone, Ulises or another friend, to come by and appraise the thing for me. It was an endless cycle of imaginary economies, small profits and favors done impulsively or not at all. That was fine so long as your rent was controlled. Anna Reddick came with cash in hand, $10,000. She had the bills neatly stacked and facing the same direction, the way a waitress arranges her tips at the end of a shift. "Catch him at it," she said, "and you'll get a bonus, paid out in cash, check, wire, money order, however you'd like, your choice." It had been a lean few months, and I was in no position to turn her down. Something about the case bothered me from the start. Whatever it was, I managed to put it out of my mind. The job, as I understood it, was essentially a controlled buy, just as you might have bought some weed on the street or a box of Motorola's that had fallen from the back of a truck, or 100 other things whose provenance and ultimate destination you couldn't be sure of. Only in this case, the weed was books.